everyone. So I was looking at the calendar today and I realized we are like at the end of the semester. So we got one more class today. Y'all get to go enjoy Thanksgiving break, and then we'll have the final class after Thanksgiving break, and then we're done with. So thanks for sticking with me all semester. This has been the weirdest semester ever for both you and me. I was watching the news this week and I saw the weather and I was like, a weatherman is exactly what I feel like every time I'm trying to film the lesson. Stand in front of a camera and a board and point, and it's bizarre. So today we're going to go through Chapter 15. Chapter 15 is Monopolies. We're going to be talking about monopolies. And if you'll recall, I drew you a spectrum at one point, and I said in the world of economics we have markets that exist along a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have perfect competition, which is what we talked about already. And then at the other end of the spectrum are firms that are monopolies. So we hit this end of the spectrum. Now we're going to just swing all the way over to the other side and think about the opposite of a perfectly competitive market, which is a market that has a monopoly. Okay, so first of all, what is a monopoly? So a monopoly is a firm that is the only producer of a good that doesn't have close substitutes. So not only does there need to be one firm that's kind of like supplying the product for the entire market, but they need to be making a product where there's not any kind of other product that consumers can easily substitute for the product that they're making. So what is monopoly? All right. What is it? A monopoly is a firm that is the only seller of a product or service, but we'll just put in product for brevity, without close substitutes. Okay, let me find a better marker. Okay, there's going to be a couple other characteristics of monopolies. The second characteristic that kind of tells us what a monopoly is a monopoly is a price maker. So when we were talking about perfect competition, we said firms that are in perfectly competitive markets are price takers. Like they're just like infinitesimally small relative to the size of the whole market, and so they have no power in terms of influencing the price by their own behavior. Well, if there's only one firm in the market, then whatever that firm does, it definitely influences the market. And so because of that, monopolies definitely have the ability to kind of set the price where they want to set it. And so we're going to say that monopolies are price makers. And then the last kind of thing I'm going to tack on here is that monopolies are an artifact of barriers to entry. So we said that perfectly competitive markets are markets where firms can freely enter and exit the market. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have markets where there's not free entry into the market. So a monopoly exists when it is like impossible for other firms to break into the market and start selling the product. So what is it, a monopoly? It's an artifact of barriers to entry. So in other words, other firms can't enter the market to compete with a monopoly. Enter the market to compete with the monopoly. Okay, so this kind of begs the question, why would there be barriers to entry? Like, what are things that would prevent some other firm from coming in and becoming a seller of the product? Well, there's going to be a couple of kind of ways that barriers to entry can arise. So, let me find myself in my notes. Okay, so the question I'm thinking about is like, why are there barriers to entry? Okay, So I'm just going to give you a whole bunch of possibilities to why there might be, in particular markets, barriers to entry. Okay, so one possibility is that when you're producing a product or service, you need inputs or you need ingredients to produce the product. Well, if one firm has like exclusive ownership of one of the ingredients, then that means no one else can make the product because no one else has the necessary ingredients. And so when this arises, you get a monopoly. So what would be an example of this? Let's think about a secret recipe. So suppose there's some company that has a secret recipe for this, some kind of like something you eat or something you drink. Well, if you have the secret recipe, that's like a necessary ingredient to make the thing. And so if that thing that they're making doesn't have close substitutes, like no one else can come up with another recipe that even compares with what the original baker is making, well then that baker is going to get a monopoly because they're the only ones with the recipe. No one else can come up with any other recipe that kind of generates a baked good that's a good substitute. So that's one reason where there might be a barrier to entering that particular market, because no one else has the ingredients to like become a seller of the product. Okay, so reason number one, or possibility number one, is maybe a key ingredient for production is owned by a single firm. Okay, a better example of this is in the world, so if you think about the market for diamonds, most diamonds come from like the South Africa region, and there's one firm that owns the land there. And so they have the land where the diamonds are held. And so it's very hard for other firms to kind of break into the diamond industry because they don't have access to the land where the diamonds are, and there's no close substitutes for diamonds. And so because of that, you kind of get a market where one company kind of has a monopoly in the diamonds, in the world of diamonds. Okay, second possibility is sometimes, or maybe, the government kind of makes a monopoly. So the idea here is that the government might give a single firm exclusive rights to produce the good or the product. So for example, we have copyrights and we have patents. And so if some inventor creates this like wonderful gadget and they go get a patent on it, well then that's effectively the government saying like, you are the only one who's allowed to produce this. And so that inventor can have a monopoly because no one else is legally able to enter the market and produce that same thing because they don't have the patent that the original inventor has. So why might there be a barrier to entry? Maybe the government gives one firm exclusive rights to produce. So example, again, would be patents and copyrights. Okay, the last reason why there might be barriers to entry is that in particular markets, and this doesn't always happen, but in particular markets, what is true about how the market works is that the more units you can produce, the more the cost of production goes down. And so in other words, the bigger a firm gets, the more they can kind of whittle down on their costs. And this arises because of something called economies of scale. So the idea is that the more you can scale up, the more your average costs fall. So think about this in terms of competition. If the way you can minimize your cost is to produce as many units as possible, then what that's going to mean is that it's going to be cheaper for one firm to make a whole bunch of units than for two smaller firms to make fewer amounts individually, because the fewer units you have, the higher the costs are. The reason that's important is because if you can get your costs down lower, then you can undercut your competitors in terms of your prices. And so when we have economies of scale, this leads to something that we call natural monopolies, whereby it's less expensive for one firm to serve the entire market than for multiple smaller firms to serve the market. Okay, so maybe number 3 is maybe there's an economy of scale. What an economy of scale is it's equivalent. It's like saying that the more a firm produces, the more their average total costs go down. And when this happens, what this leads to is the fact that one big firm will be able to produce, make some room here, will be able to produce a good at a lower price, or really cost, because you can price down your cost, than multiple smaller firms. Okay, and we call this, again I mentioned this, we call this a natural monopoly, because the idea is that what just characterizes a particular market is that the bigger you get, the more your costs go down, then that just kind of pushes that market into a monopoly, because having one firm get bigger, as a firm gets bigger and bigger, they can kind of make when their cost goes down, they can push their prices down. If they push your prices down, then they become even more competitive. Smaller firms drop out of the market, and we just kind of converge naturally to a monopoly. Okay, so next thing is I want to highlight something that is distinct between monopolies and perfectly competitive firms. So one thing that we talked about last class, maybe it was 2 classes ago, was that in perfectly competitive markets, a unique characteristic of perfectly competitive markets is that the price in those markets is equal to the marginal cost. Is equal to the marginal revenue. That is not going to be true for monopolies. So we're going to put a big kind of unlike caveat in our notes. So unlike perfectly competitive markets, in monopolies, the marginal revenue is going to be less than the price. And what could also be true is that the marginal revenue is also allowed to be negative for monopolies. So I'm going to show you this in a minute, but for your notes, just write it out. So marginal revenue for monopolies is less than the price, and marginal revenue can be negative. Okay, to help you understand this, let's just make a table real quick, and then calculate marginal revenue and just compare it to price and just verify that this thing that I've told you is actually true. So let's make a table where we plot quantity, or we have quantity in one column, we have price in another column, we have total revenue in another column, and we have marginal revenue in the last column. Okay, I'm just going to start out here. I'm going to put some numbers here. So we'll have a quantity of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And what's now going to be important is that I'm going to put numbers in here that are consistent with the law of demand. Okay, what is the law of demand? The law of demand says as you increase the price, fewer people buy the good, quantity goes down, and vice versa. So I'm going to put numbers here. I'm just kind of making these up. But we'll say we have 11 in the first row, 10, 9, 8, 7. Okay, why am I putting these numbers here? I'm putting these numbers here because monopolies are price makers. So if you recall, when we did a similar table for perfect competition, we said because perfectly competitive firms are price takers, we had one price that went all the way down the table. Like, because firms just took the price, it didn't matter how many units we were thinking about, they were going to take the same price. Well, for monopolies, they're not price takers at all. So that means because they're making the price, when they set the price at various levels, there's going to be different quantities. There's going to be different quantities that people buy. Okay, so now we can start filling in the table. So total revenue is always price times quantity. So if you multiply these two things, we get 0 in the first row, we get 10 in the next row, we get 18, we get 24, and we get 28. And now we can calculate marginal revenue. So marginal revenue is the same thing as before. The idea of marginal revenue is we look at the change in the quantity, and then we look at the change in the total revenue. And then specifically, marginal revenue is going to be the change in total revenue divided by the change in the quantity. So if the firm goes from 0 to 1, and their total revenue goes from 0 to 10, then the marginal change in their revenue at this kind of increment is going to be 10. Okay, now, if from 1 they change their quantity and go up to 2, then their total revenue is going to change from 10 to 18. So there's going to be a marginal revenue here of 8. Now, if they change their quantity from 2 to 3, that's a 1 unit change in quantity, there's going to be a change in total revenue from 18 to 24. So the marginal revenue is going to be 6. And then last one here is if they change their quantity from 3 to 4, total revenue will go up from 24 to 28, so the marginal revenue is going to be 4. Okay, what did we say here? We said that marginal revenue for a monopoly is less than the price. Okay, when the price was here, so somewhere between 11 and 10, so maybe like 10.5, the marginal revenue is 10. When the price was here, so between 9 and 10, so maybe like 9.5, the marginal revenue is 8, which is less than that. When the price was in here, so between 8 and 9, so maybe like 8.50, the marginal revenue is 6. And when the price was between 7 and 8, so maybe like 7.50, the marginal revenue is 4. So the marginal revenue here is less than the price. And again, the reason that we get marginal revenue not being equal to the price, which was what was kind of the name of the game in perfect competition, is because in the world of monopolies, monopolies are price setters, and that kind of changes the relationship between the price and the marginal revenue. Okay, so next thing is if it is true that marginal revenue is less than the price, so let me kind of keep this little inequality over here. So if it is true that marginal revenue is less than the price, then let's think about what this means for the graph. So demand curves are related to the price. So demand curves tell us what quantities will be consumed at different price levels. So what's going to be the case when we draw the picture for a monopoly, flip the page, is that when we draw a monopoly's demand curve, which is going to be downward sloping like the typical demand curve we've been thinking about, this is going to tell us the prices that we're thinking about when we're thinking about this. Okay, if the marginal revenue is less than the prices, then what that means is that the marginal revenue curve is always going to be underneath the demand curve. And typically when these are drawn, the marginal revenue is also going to cross 0, And if this is 0 and this is positive above it and negative below it, then that means having a marginal revenue that crosses this axis will yield marginal revenue values that are negative. So when you see marginal revenue curves drawn, they usually look like this. So usually you have the demand curve, underneath it you have a steeper marginal revenue curve, and the marginal revenue curve crosses 0. Okay, so what are we going to do with this now? Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put ourselves in the shoes of monopolists, and we're going to say, okay, suppose I'm the owner of this firm that has all the land in South Africa that has diamonds on it, and so I'm going to be the monopoly that kind of sells diamonds. Okay, so the question is, like, what do I do in terms of production? Well, here's one thing that's going to be similar between monopolies and perfectly competitive firms. The calculus doesn't change. We did a little bit of calculus last class, and what we said is that if we want a firm to maximize their profit, so if you have a profit function where profit is a function of quantity, well then what's true about the quantity that coincides with the maximum profit level is that the slope of the profit function with respect to quantity is going to be 0, which means that this optimal quantity that maximizes profit will be such that the slope of this, or the derivative of the profit function with respect to quantity, will be equal to 0. When you kind of go through what that means is that what characterizes this is that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Okay, so what that means for us is, because that doesn't change, like the calculus is fixed, what's going to be true for a monopoly is that, same as before, the monopolist, or the monopoly, will want to produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and this is in order to maximize their profit. Okay, so now let's kind of draw this out. So I'm going to erase and redraw the exact same thing, so that way you'll have an incentive to redraw the exact same thing in your notes and have an extra opportunity to trace this out. Okay, so what that means is, if we put ourselves in the shoes of a monopoly, they look at their demand curve, they see this is what their demand looks like. The demand tells you different prices that coincide with different quantities. They look at their marginal revenue curve, which is steeper than their demand curve, and it's underneath it. And then we said typically marginal cost curves slope up. What does the monopoly do? They find the place on this graph where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and they say wherever that crosshair is, that's how many units I'm going to produce, because that's going to be the level of production that's going to maximize my profit. So in this case, we've got marginal revenue here, we've got marginal cost here. So this crosshair is going to be what determines how many units the monopoly will want to produce. They're not going to want to produce more than that, otherwise they'd kind of be, otherwise if they produce more than that, then they'd be losing profit. If they produce less than that, then they'd be losing profit. So this is going to be the sweet spot. Okay, the next thing is, well, this is the quantity that they're going to produce. Well, there's an extra decision that a monopoly has to make that a perfectly competitive firm does not have to make, and that is, what are we going to set the price tag at? Because recall that the perfectly competitive firm, they just took the price, so they didn't have to make that decision. But the monopoly, they're price makers, so they have to ask themselves, okay, after I've set my level of production, what am I going to make the price? Well, what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, this demand curve tells me the different prices that people are willing to pay for different quantities. So the demand curve tells me that if this is the quantity that I'm shooting to produce, then this right here is going to be the price that people are willing to pay for it. So what the monopoly is going to do is they're going to anchor themselves at the optimal profit maximizing quantity. At that quantity, they're going to slide all the way up to the demand curve so that the demand curve can tell them what is the price that they can charge consumers, so that when they charge that price, they'll sell exactly that number of units. Okay, so this is kind of like decision. So this is decision 1. They decide what quantity they're going to sell. And then decision 2, so this had to do with quantity, this is going to have to do with price. Decision 2 is that they are going to put this in quote because they're price makers, they're going to make the price equal to the price on the demand curve that coincides with their optimal, and by optimal, their profit maximizing quantity, which I'm calling here Q star. Okay, so let me draw this again for you so that you can really kind of embrace what these pictures look like. Okay, I'll leave that there in case you didn't finish writing it. Okay, so let me give you a hypothetical monopoly. And let's just do it one more time. So we've got a monopoly. They've got a demand curve. They've got a marginal revenue curve. And it's price and quantity here. They've got a marginal cost curve. What do they do first of all? First of all, they set their quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost right here. This crosshair determines their quantity. What is the second thing they do? The second decision that they make? The second decision relates to like where they're going to price their good at. So they're going to make their price such that it is along the demand curve at the optimal quantity. So in other words, they say, okay, here's my optimal quantity. I'm going to peg myself at that. I'm going to look at the demand curve. I'm going to say, where on this demand curve am I sitting at my optimal quantity? Well, it's right here. And so this is going to be the price that they charge for their product. Okay, the next thing. So we had decision 1, decision 2. Now we'll call this consideration 3. We don't have consideration 1 and 2. We have decision 1 and 2, consideration number 3. The third consideration is, okay, they've set their profit maximizing quantity. They've found and set their corresponding price. The consideration is, what is their profit now? So their profit, same as before, is going to be equal to the price they charge minus the average total cost times the number of units that they sell. So this equation should not be new news to you. We've already looked at this. So what we're going to do for this graph is we're going to say, okay, let's find the different components here in the graph, and then let's plot the monopoly's level of profit. Okay, let's suppose that for this firm, their average total costs are, actually, let's remind ourselves, what are average total costs? Average total costs are a bowl of water that have an average temperature. You have a tablespoon of water, that's your marginal contribution. We said if the tablespoon of water is scalding hot and you add it to the average temperatured bowl, then the whole average temperature of the bowl rises. Conversely, if you have a really chilly tablespoon of water, you add it to the bowl, then the whole temperature of the bowl drops. Okay, what we've got here is the tablespoon. What we need to draw in is the average total cost, which is the bowl of water. So what we said needs to be true is that the average total cost is going to be falling anytime the average total cost is above the marginal cost, and then the average total cost needs to be rising anytime the marginal cost is above the average total cost. So let's draw the U. Let's make it keep the property where the marginal cost curve intersects average total cost at the bottom of the U. And we could have put this U up, we could have put it down, we're just putting it right here. And then now we've got all the components that we need. So we can see in the picture the price they're charging. We can look at their average total cost, and we know the quantity that they're producing. Okay, so first of all, the price. So the price is right here. So this is the price. The average total cost, set down some of these markers. The average total cost is going to be based on the average total cost that the firm realizes based on its level of production. So the firm is producing this many units. So let's see along the average total cost curve where kind of what our elevation is at that level of production. Well, this quantity, average total costs, are right here. So what that means is that for a firm that's producing this many units, this is the price they're selling at, this is the average total cost to make each unit, and then the quantity is just right here. So the distance from here to here is the quantity. So when we multiply this times this, we're effectively calculating the area of a rectangle, and this is the rectangle that we're looking at. The area of this rectangle is equivalent to the amount of profit that the monopoly is making. Okay, this should look very, very similar to what we had going on for perfect competition because it's basically the same thing. So to figure out profit, you first look at the price, you compare that to the average total cost, that gives you the height of the rectangle, and then you multiply that by the width of the rectangle, which is the quantity that they are producing. Okay, so to keep the list going here, so what does the monopoly do? First of all, they set their quantity. They set their quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Number two, they make their price such that it is along the demand curve where Q is at. Here's Q, here's the price. Number three is they can calculate their profit, which is going to, again, be equal to the difference between the price they're charging and the average total cost at the level of production they're sitting at, times the level of production that they have. Okay, one last consideration here. Okay, the last consideration, maybe I'll call this consideration 4. So we had decision 1, decision 2, consideration 3, now this is consideration 4. Consideration 4. Okay, consideration number 4 is that monopolies produce a quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, hang with me here. So, monopolies produce quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and we also said the price is above the marginal revenue, or conversely the marginal revenue is less than the price. And so they're going to be producing a quantity where the price is greater than the marginal cost. Okay, this is what I want you to think about. Okay, if you think way back when we talked about welfare economics and consumer surplus and producer surplus and deadweight loss and all that stuff, What is true about an economy or a market that is operating efficiently is that if they're operating efficiently and there's no deadweight loss and the pie is kind of as big as it can be, then what is true in those situations is that the price is equal to the marginal cost. That's not true here. So what's true here is that a monopoly prices higher than they should if what should be is that the price is equal to the marginal cost for efficiency. Okay, so the consideration, so let me write, so this is what a monopoly does, but then note, so although monopolies price above the marginal cost, note that the efficient quantity is where the price equals the marginal cost. Okay, what that means is that monopolies are going to generate a deadweight loss. Okay, so we're going to draw this picture one more time in the next 5 minutes, and then we may redraw it again. Okay, so a monopoly, they've got their demand curve, they've got their marginal revenue curve, they've got a marginal cost curve. The monopoly owner sets their quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. At that quantity, they go up to the demand curve, they figure out what price they're going to charge. Okay, this right here, this Q star, this is the monopoly's level of production. At this level of production, the price is above the marginal cost, right? So the marginal cost is right here. So this is the quantity we're anchoring ourselves at. This is the price level. This is the marginal cost and the marginal revenue. Maybe we should put the marginal revenue here. And so here, the price exceeds the marginal revenue. Okay, what is efficient is when a monopoly produces a quantity where price is equal to marginal cost. I'm sorry, this should be marginal cost. My mistake. This is what happens when I make messy notes for myself. Okay, so in your notes, what's important is that, what's important is that what the monopoly does is they charge a price that's above the marginal cost. What is efficient is when they price at the marginal cost. And so if they're going to be efficient, what would they do? They would produce where the price, which is the demand curve, is equal to the marginal cost. And so this crosshair right here is the Q that is efficient. Okay, so what this means is that the monopoly is producing too little quantity relative to what is efficient. So this disparity here is going to kind of tell us, is going to be informative in telling us how much deadweight loss there is. Okay, the area of deadweight loss is going to correspond to a triangle, and the triangle is going to be the difference between the price that they're charging and the marginal cost at the quantity that they're producing. And then the base of the triangle is going to be the disparity between the quantity that they're actually making and the efficient quantity. So this triangle here is going to have an area, and the area of that triangle is going to be equivalent to the deadweight loss that results when you have one firm that's running the entire show in the market, and they're setting the price, and they're operating in terms of what is beneficial for them, because they're the only ones they really have to care about. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to just kind of put down here, in case you've forgotten what deadweight loss are. Recall that deadweight losses are like social losses. So it's kind of the social loss that stems from producing an inefficient quantity, and in this case, we're having a monopoly that's producing a quantity that's too little. So like they're not producing as much as we would like them to produce. If we wanted to maximize the size of the economic pie or maximize total welfare. So just as a reminder here, so just recall, deadweight loss is a social loss from the inefficiently low quantity of output or production. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do here before we break for 10 minutes is, I think sometimes there's so many moving gears when we're trying to think about the different market types that you kind of forget which characteristics go with which market type. So I'm going to do a head-to-head comparison of these. This is how a perfectly competitive firm and market look, and then here's how monopoly works. So hopefully this will just kind of help you get some organization in your mind in terms of how these two market structures that are polar opposites of each other on the spectrum stack up. Okay, so in the first column, actually let me label this, so we're going to call this just a recap / comparison. Okay, so what we're going to have over here is, let's think about a perfectly competitive firm, or a firm in a perfectly competitive market. And then over here, let's think about the opposite of that, which would be a monopoly. Okay, first difference is, in a perfectly competitive market, an individual firm is a price taker. Okay, monopolies are price makers. What does this mean? This means that in a perfectly competitive firm, there's so many sellers that any one seller can do whatever they want, and they're so small relative to the size of the market that they cannot make the price budge based on their behavior, so they just take the price. A monopoly, they're the only firm in the market, so clearly if they move, then the market is going to be affected, and so they can make the price a market. Okay, the reason, again, for perfectly competitive firms being price takers is because there's many, and at the extreme, there's like an infinite number of producers. Whereas in the case of monopoly, the monopoly is the sole producer. So this causes this, this causes this. Okay, in perfectly competitive markets, there's going to kind of be two graphs you need to have in your mind. There's going to be a graph for the market. There's going to be a graph for the individual firm. Okay, in the markets graph, you're going to have a downward sloping demand, so we're going to call this big D. But for the individual firm, they're going to take the price on the market. So if in the market there's this supply and demand, then this equilibrium price here is going to be what the individual firm just has to take. So this bar is equal to the price. It's also equal to the marginal revenue. But implicitly, this is also the demand curve for the individual firm. So in perfectly competitive markets, one individual perfectly competitive firm has a horizontal demand. In the overall market, there's a downward sloping demand, but one individual firm is so itty-bitty relative to the market that they can't influence the price. So for the individual firm, the price is going to be this amount no matter how many units they produce. Okay, in the case of monopoly, the market is the individual firm. So there's only one producer, and so in the case of monopoly, there's a downward sloping demand for the individual firm. Okay, so what's important here is that the individual firm has horizontal demand, whereas over here in the case of monopoly, the individual firm, which is the monopoly, which is the market, has a downward sloping demand. Okay, and note again, all of this ties together, right? So this being horizontal is another way of reflecting that they're a price taker. The individual firm in a perfectly competitive market is a price taker because they can sell as many units as they want. It doesn't change the price. This is consistent with a horizontal demand. Whereas a monopoly, the individual firm, the monopoly, if they change their quantity, that changes the price. So by picking their quantity, they can play with the price. Okay, I'm going to keep going down. I'm going to erase them up here so I don't have to crouch as much. Okay, one thing that's going to be similar, so this is going to be where these two firms line up, is that for both firms, to maximize profit, the individual firm will produce a quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the same in both market structures. So for perfectly competitive firms, they find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the number that determines their Q. Exactly the same thing for a monopoly. And the last thing here is, they're going to differ on this next column. The last thing here is that in perfectly competitive firms, the price that they take is equal to their marginal revenue. Whereas for monopoly, the price is greater than the marginal revenue. Therefore, the price is going to be greater than the marginal cost. And so what we see here is that there's an inefficiency, or in other words, there's a deadweight loss. Whereas over here, because this is marginal cost, and efficiency means price equals marginal cost, there is going to be no, or I'll just put, instead of saying no inefficiency, there's going to be efficiency and no deadweight loss. Okay, so let me draw you the pictures for this really quickly. So for a perfectly competitive firm, this is one individual firm. They've got a price that's equal to their marginal revenue. They've got a marginal cost. They're going to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's going to give them their quantity of output. There's no deadweight loss there. For a monopoly, they've got a demand curve. They've got a marginal revenue curve. They've got a marginal cost curve. They're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is right here. Based on this quantity, they're going to go up to their demand curve, and this is going to be the price that they're going to set themselves at. Well, this is their price. This is the marginal cost at the quantity that they're producing. And so this triangle here is going to be deadweight loss. Again, let me just kind of highlight, the triangle starts at the quantity that they're actually manufacturing. The quantity ends at the point where the demand curve and the marginal cost curve intersect. Why? Because the efficient quantity, which is the end of the triangle, so that is the Q that's efficient. The end of the triangle here is consistent with the price or the demand curve being equal to the marginal cost, which is always the case for a perfectly competitive firm, and it is not the case for the monopoly. The monopoly does not produce that quantity. Okay, so we made it through monopolies in a hurry. If you have questions, let me know in the next 10 minutes, and then after that, we'll meet back and do the exercise. Okay, now it's time to practice this a little bit. So what I'm going to have for you up on the screen in Blackboard is a picture of the curves that correspond to a particular monopoly. So there's going to be a demand curve, a marginal revenue curve, a marginal cost curve, and a U-shaped average total cost curve, and then there's also going to be numbers along the axes. Okay, so the first question I'd like you to answer is, what quantity would the monopoly produce if they wanted to maximize their profit? Recall that they produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost if they want to maximize their profit. So find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. At that crosshair, you go down, you find the number along the horizontal axis. That's the answer to number 1. Okay, question number 2 is, what price would they charge? Recall that prices are based on the demand curve. So after you figure out the quantity that they would go with, you peg yourself at that quantity, you go up to the demand curve, and you find the price and the price that they would charge. Question number 3 is, what would the monopoly's profit be? Recall, profit is equivalent to the area of a rectangle, and the height of the rectangle is based on the price that the monopoly charges relative to the average total cost, and then the base of the rectangle is equal to the quantity that they produce. Okay, last question is, what will be the amount of deadweight loss that results in this market? Okay, recall deadweight loss is equivalent to the area of a triangle. A triangle has an area of 1/2 base times height. So helpful reminder, area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. For the deadweight loss, the base of the triangle is the difference between the quantity that they actually produce and the efficient quantity, and the height, hopefully you'll see, you draw this out, shade in the triangle, and then that will give you the height, and then calculate the deadweight loss. Okay, so as a quick reminder, we only have 1 class left. I found out it's super hard to get through all the material when I'm doing this online, just because I'm trying to not talk at you for an hour and 15 minutes. So what that means is, since there's 2 chapters left in the textbook that are relevant, I'm just going to smush them all together into a final lesson, and then just kind of give you the big highlights. So what that means is you got 2 chapters to read during the break. So before next class, read chapters 16 and 17, and then I'll wrap up the class by doing a real quick breeze through of both of these chapters next time I see you. I hope you all have a really good Thanksgiving. I'm thankful to have you in class, even though it's not really in class. But good work so far, and I will see you after the break.